Welcome to the Debt Crisis Problem Podcast, your source for insights into major risk events that could trigger an economic downturn and debt crisis. Today we're addressing another key risk, national debt levels. Our goal is to create risk awareness and spark a healthy debate for the average citizen. The world is too fragile to wait. We need fresh candor and common sense. A debt crisis looms due to unsustainable debt and deficit spending everywhere. It's time to wake up and speak up. Let's get started. Massive buildup in debt everywhere. Take a few minutes and pull up the usdebtclock.org and ponder on those numbers that you see there. When you think of the individual people who might be behind any one of those statistics, it's beyond heartbreaking, really. These people are not numbers. They are people just like you and me. Their burdens are real, and they're not pretended burdens. And sadly, collectively, the burdens are only getting heavier. The U.S. debt clock shows, in the period of people's most lifetimes, an enormous amount of debt. It's almost staggering. Look at the total unfunded debt obligations owed by the U.S. government. The debts I'm talking about consist of unfunded payments to recipients for Social Security, Medicare, prescription drugs, and national health care, as projected in the future. The U.S. government has borrowed from these trust funds that belong to the people, so many people don't view this owing as a debt owing because the U.S. government intends on paying out benefits and will get the money from somewhere else. So it isn't borrowed money in that sense. But honestly, folks, it claims its intention on paying all these future commitments, but can it honestly say today that the $97 trillion, soon to be $109 trillion, will be paid out over the future? Some would argue unfunded liabilities are really 150 to 200 trillion plus dollars. Can it even conceivably pay those commitments along with everything else too? Not to mention the deficit spending it will incur for the next big event, any one of which or any combination of those risks that are cited in the debt crisis problem? Not a chance without more massive borrowing, which is what will happen until one morning it breaks. It has been said, comparatively, that the estimated $97 trillion in unfunded liabilities is more than the total goods and service produced in the entire world in a year. Use common sense. Certainly to say the U.S. government has any chance of paying out $97 trillion, soon to grow to $109 trillion and even beyond that, I believe is misleading or worse. It is not going to happen. The needs of the aging population will surely outstrip the resources the U.S. government can afford, with all its overspending, etc. Why can't it not be funded? Because it is impossible unless you just add more debt on top of debt. Think of a debt spiral. The U.S. government would have to raise taxes and reduce services such that it would not even begin to work, right? It can't even pay the interest on its current debt and everything else without more borrowing. It will never happen, and anybody or everybody who is honest and can think for themselves knows it. But there is no national debate or discussion or transparency about it. So it is up to the people to just use common sense and pay attention to their own financial condition. Like get out of the way of the tsunami. Use more common sense. Moreover, with some 43 million people currently living in poverty and 100 million not even in the labor force, who are you going to tax to cover the $2+ trillion annual deficits, let alone the future $97 trillion of unfunded liability commitments? Again, it's not going to happen unless you print untold trillions of dollars, making the dollar's value bankruptcy worthy, and cause hyperinflation and massive interest rate hikes, right? Which ultimately means seasons of default and restructuring, asset bubble collapses, etc. It's not a question of if, but when. And because of that, it's highly irresponsible and immoral to not talk about this risk on a national scale. U.S. government officials, supervisory agencies, rating agencies, economists, bankers should be totally transparent, but they are not. Such warning voices are minimal and completely insufficient. Why? Because they all know if they tell the full story, it's game over. I believe they are complicit together in not being square with the people, because if they were, their business models would collapse, or at least be severely disrupted. And therefore nobody wants that, and nothing is said. Using more common sense suggests the musical chairs game will just continue until one day the music stops. Take a look at the federal national debt. It's beyond insane the levels of spending the U.S. has incurred since just 2016, when the national debt was $20 trillion. In early 2024, just 8 years later, the national debt has increased to over 34. It's now $35 trillion. That's $14-15 trillion in a short period of time. Talk about living off a giant credit card. Hello? What do you think would happen to the economy if the $14 trillion weren't spent? And in just the next 4 years, it's expected to reach $46 trillion. That's another $12 trillion increase. It's completely out of control, and voices are starting to emerge now that the national debt has reached $35 trillion. Can anyone even comprehend how much money that is? Try to comprehend, not $35 trillion, but just $1 trillion. That is the same as 1,000 billions, or a million millions. 35 trillion translates into 35,000 billions, or 35 million millions. No one can comprehend how much money that is. The national debt will never be repaid or substantially reduced, nor in our current lifetimes will it ever be paid down to a meaningful, safe level. With all the 20 noted risks events facing this unstable world today that are in the Debt Crisis podcast, the federal debt level will likely only increase even faster than the projections until it defaults and its debts become restructured debts. The damage will be felt forever with asset bubble collapses and much more. Unemployed persons. Look at that. It seems like most anyone in early 2024 who once wanted a job could find one. Hopefully it's still that way as we go into 2025, but more and more job layoffs are happening. It's also taking longer to find a good job. Some 11 million unemployed people is a significant number of individuals. The Great Recession in 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic obviously impacted unemployment, with gradual declines in the unemployment rate after each event. And while unemployment numbers tend to increase as the economy expands, it can contract quickly, as we've recently seen. The numbers of post-baby boomer workers after 1964 is fewer than the number of baby boomers who are retiring. A couple of risks are startling apparent. Answer this one. The U.S. government certainly can't collect needed revenues from unemployed persons. How will the unfunded liabilities payments like Social Security, Medicaid, prescription drugs, national health be paid out to baby boomers with ever-increasing health costs and less workers to pay into the system? Seniors and others will need the U.S. government benefits they have paid into their whole lives, as private pensions are becoming a relic and personal savings isn't going to carry the day either. Add unhealthy lifestyles. Perhaps as equally concerning is the apparent health profile of the typical American citizen. Is society getting sicker as it continually engages in unhealthy behaviors such as drinking alcohol, smoking, vaping, marijuana use, and other harmful drugs? All unhealthy lifestyles? It's hard to argue that a society will prosper long term if it is less healthy than it otherwise might be. Healthcare costs are only going to exponentially increase, along with the deficit spending and the debt levels beyond current projections. It has to. Again, I'm just talking about common sense. This short ad is sponsored by the TunaBudget.com podcast. Hey friends, looking to improve your personal and family financial wellness? Don't miss the Tuna Budget podcasts at TunaBudget.com. Download your free Tuna Budget worksheet plan, the most powerful budget worksheet plan in the world, yours. In addition, dozens of Tuna Budget's human-side candid conversation memos may be the perfect answers you're looking for. Join us for real candid conversation and candid questions that can change your life for the better. Subscribe to the TunaBudget.com podcasts and empower yourself to take charge of your future and financial well-being. Next, go to living in poverty. Look at that one. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the 2023 poverty level for a family of 4 is $30,000. And per the U.S. debt clock, there are some 43 million people who are living in poverty. There aren't enough words to express how heartbreaking this is, but I'll try it anyway. My heart goes out to those who have somehow ended up in this position. My hope is that those so affected can use the power of their choices, power that they've always had, to get any assistance in these areas to improve their lives. For example, pursue any higher education opportunities that may come, saving any amount of money as possible, avoiding any risky behaviors like drug abuse, which, I believe, destroys people's hopes and dreams. Get adequate health care if possible. Certainly avoid doing dumb things, any criminal activity, and use a good budget plan to manage finances. Avoid gambling, get healthy somehow, show a strong work ethic, show up early, leave a little bit late, shorter lunches, develop skills for communication, problem solving, time management, building relationships out there, a positive attitude. Every one of these skills and measures can be made from daily choices. So that's what I might say there. And by the way, if you don't know how, for whatever, ask for help and just try out your best. No excuses. Chances are, if you try and don't give up, you're going to succeed. And when you do fail, get back up and try again. No giving up here, ever. Okay, moving on. Food stamp recipients. Look at that one. To qualify for federal assistance under the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP I think it's called, also known as food stamps, a household must have a gross monthly income at or below 130% of the poverty level and a net monthly income at or below 100% of the federal poverty level. 41 million people receive this assistance, and once again, the number is overwhelming. These individual cases must be heartbreaking. There have been, on average, more than 40 million people each year receiving food stamps since 2012. It is entirely likely that the number will be understated, and more people than ever will be relying on the U.S. government for their survival. Think of the millions and millions and millions of people that are coming into the country illegally, for example. How about those not in the labor force? This refers to people who are not currently employed and are not actively seeking employment. In 2000, there were only 69 million such people, and 24 years later, there are about 100 million people, an increase of 45%. Obviously, the baby boomer generation is getting older, plus adults with disabilities or those attending college and not working. Other people may be discouraged and have given up on looking for work. The fewer people working can only result in slower economic growth. It will probably mean an increased demand for U.S. government assistance too. Next, let's talk about the debt to GDP ratio. A comparison of debt, what is owed, to gross domestic product, what is produced in America. The ratio is a way to see how well debts can be repaid. The higher the debt ratio, the higher the credit risk or potential for non-payment or default. It shows how stable a nation's economy is. It is too easy for a nation like the U.S. to materially live off its credit cards, Federal Reserve Bank, but that is not wise, and it is unsafe and unsound. It's not sustainable. In most cases, debts as they become due and because of deficit spending, those debts will not be repaid but just refinanced and rolled up into new debt. The lower the debt to GDP ratio, the easier it is to conceivably repay. Heavy debt levels since 2008 have increased by $23 trillion because of massive deficit spending. Any chance it will slow down or reverse course? No chance. Another $12 trillion in the next 5 years. The current debt to GDP ratio is dangerously high to where it increases the risk of default on the debt, which would be majorly disruptive on the nation's economy and in financial markets everywhere around the world. The U.S. is currently facing wartime unrest and a possible recession. Projected deficit spending is expected to reach another whopping $12 trillion in just the next 5 years. The impact of high debt to GDP ratios. Countries having high debt to GDP ratios are known to struggle with economic growth, high unemployment, and even political instability. When default happens, it would likely result in higher interest rates or borrowing costs, inflation due to excessive printing of money, currency devaluation, impact on the banking system, social unrest, and a flight of capital. Asset bubbles collapses are also likely too. Will the real GDP ratio please stand up? The U.S. government defines the debt to GDP ratio with only the debt amount held by the public, and doesn't include the gross debt held outside the public. Isn't debt still debt, and because all debts need to be repaid? Why not use the gross debt to GDP ratio when talking about the country's financial well-being? It appears that someone has some serious explaining to do, in my opinion. The level of debt incurred by the U.S. apparently has unique accounting rules that it alone follows. There's debt that the public has financed or holds, and there is the gross debt, which includes the public debt as well as intra-U.S. governmental debt that the U.S. government technically owes to itself, like Social Security funding. But does not Social Security need to be paid too? Then why not just use the gross debt to GDP ratio so we can all see the truth of how drastic our poor financial condition really is? Which ratio would you think the average person should see and understand? The metrics always look better when you just show part of the whole story. Interesting set of books, right? Use the gross debt to GDP ratio to show the real health of the U.S. economy. Using only the debt held by the public is not an accurate measure of the U.S. government's debt burden on the economy, as some would argue. Debt held by the public, owed to the private sector, individuals, businesses, banks, insurance companies, state and local U.S. governments, pension funds, mutual funds, foreign U.S. governments and foreign entities and individuals, and now the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, all must be repaid. And so does the U.S. government's obligations to pay intra-U.S. government debt, like Social Security obligations. All that has to be picked up into the gross debt number. The better way to hold leaders accountable and understand the real health of the economy is to primarily calculate the debt to GDP ratio by focusing and discussing the gross debt, which includes Social Security payments, for crying out loud. The debt to GDP ratio using the debt held by the public should just be a footnote. Now, total debt per citizen and personal debt per citizen. Look at that on that debt clock. Perhaps there's no other metric in the debt table that is more relatable or demonstrate the obsceneness of the underlying debt levels. To compare the total debt per U.S. citizen or the personal debt per U.S. citizen to the actual budgets of average American households, you can get a quick sense of the enormous risk that there is to the U.S. economy. Okay? Check this out. First, we got a little article, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, Economic Well-Being of Households in 2022 as of May of 2023. It says, 30% of Americans lack enough money to cover a $400 emergency expense, up 5% from 32% in 2021 and back to 2019 levels. Consumers would have to use credit, turn to family, sell assets, or get a loan to cover any major unexpected costs. When asked about non-emergency expenses, 18% of Americans said the largest expense they could cover using only their savings was just under $100. The massive U.S. debt burden has been slyly spread out on the backs of every U.S. citizen, and it is at absurd levels. Okay? Here we go. Just 24 years ago, in 2000, the total debt per taxpayer was $53,000. It is now $264,000, a 400% increase, and soon to be $332,000. And almost 40% of Americans cannot come up with $400. Actual personal debt levels are astonishing, frankly, beyond astonishing. The average debt per citizen in 2000 was $20,000 and is now $101,000 and expected to hit $132,000 soon. Talk about unsustainable. Just wait until unemployment increases, right? Wow. In conclusion, how does the national debt risk affect you? America's debt burden is extremely heavy. America's collective debt burden will increase and become unsustainably burdensome. The recent debt metrics are alarming, especially when we add in U.S. government's unfunded obligation of $97 trillion, soon to be $109 trillion, for entitlement spending. The 20 Risks in the Debt Crisis podcast will negatively impact the U.S. economy further, just as they always do and they have. But remember that the current debt levels are at dangerously high levels. So every day, our serious lack of capacity to address future disruption events is increasing, which will push up inflation and even stagflation. Some 43 million people are currently living in poverty. 41 million people are receiving food stamp assistance, increasing to 46 million by 2028, and some 100 million people are not even in the labor force. The U.S. citizenry will not even be able to cover the structural approximately $2 trillion annual deficits as far as the eye can see. Heavy debt levels since 2008 increased by $23 trillion from massive debt spending. Projected deficit spending will reach a whopping $12 trillion in just the next 5 years. Redefining debt to GDP ratio to measure economic health. There is no national discussion or awareness of a pending debt crisis to hold leadership accountable. Why would there be, right? For example, the U.S. government defines the debt to GDP ratio using only the debt amount held by the public, so that makes everything sound better. It excludes the gross debt held outside the public. Using only the debt held by the public is not a complete measure of the U.S. government debt burden on the economy. It just makes it look like it's all better. It is better, however, if we could hold leaders accountable and understand the real health of the economy by primarily calculating the debt to GDP ratio using the gross debt, which includes Social Security payments. The debt to GDP ratio using the debt held by the public should just be a footnote. Debt level per citizen is overwhelming. Additionally, to support the need to bring awareness to the citizenry, we must compare the level of debt effectively placed on the back of every citizen from federal spending. We must show how utterly unsustainable and ridiculous the debt levels are today and compare that to the actual health of the average citizen. For example, currently 37% of Americans lack enough money to cover a $400 emergency expense. For non-emergency expenses, 18% of Americans say the largest expenditure they could cover using only their savings was just under $100. Consumers would have to use credit, turn to family, sell assets, or get a loan to cover any major unexpected cost. Compare all this to the massive debt burden placed on each citizen. Just 24 years ago, in 2000, the total debt per taxpayer was $53,000. It's now $264,000, and soon to be $332,000. And almost 40% of Americans can't come up with $400. The average debt per citizen was $20,000 in 2020. It's now $101,000 and still increasing. My estimate is that other disruptive risk events will be widely felt between now and sometimes through 2025. The risk will be a debt crisis. The result will be a debt crisis. America's collective debt burden is truly increasing and unsustainably burdensome. Can you smell a debt crisis yet? Thank you for joining us. Today we explored national debt levels, a major risk contributing to the looming debt crisis. We hope to highlight the urgent need for transparency around these risks. We want to hear from you too. Submit your own debt crisis memo and share your thoughts at tunabudget.com. If you found today's episode valuable, please subscribe for future podcasts. Your support helps grow this healthy debate. Until next time, take all necessary precautions. Your financial wellness matters. Thanks again.